Well, today we're starting our new studies in Daniel, having come to an end of John's Gospel. Perhaps I should say I do apologize that you've had to listen to my voice a couple of times now over the last few weeks. Any complaints, you can submit them to Tim and Josh and Stevie. But if nothing else, I'm sure it's helping you get acquainted with the Australian accent. I'm almost worried that you'll all start walking around with Australian accents, which would be perhaps not a great thing. Let's turn then to Daniel chapter 1, and we'll read the chapter together, reading from verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king assigned to them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself, and God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink, for why should he see that you were in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. Then Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. For these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar, and the king spoke with them. And among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. And Daniel was there until the 1st year of King Cyrus. Now, I have an intention this morning of doing 3 things. One is to give you a little bit of background, historical, geographical background to the setting of the book of Daniel. I'm not going to spend very long on that. There are copious volumes that are written about the Babylonian Empire and even the end of the reign of the kings of Judah and so on. And I know that I think last year you were studying First and Second Kings, so you're well acquainted with that. In a sense, Daniel is almost just coming at the end of Second Kings. So I'll do a little bit on that, and then we'll go through some of the verses in chapter 1, and then if time permit, at the end of that, we might look a little about how chapter 1 fits into the overall book itself. I'm doing it in that order and not going through chapter 1 till the end, in case I don't get to chapter 1 and then I get told I didn't even do the very thing that I was meant to do. So we'll do it in that order. Now, just for a little bit of historical background. Hang on. What's happening there, Tim? Are you doing it, Tim? Right, this is going to be complicated. I'm sure you're fairly well aware of some of the geography of the area. And I want to just remind you of precisely where Israel fitted, not just into the geography, but into history. You remember around 800 years or so before the time of Daniel, depending on where you put the Exodus in terms of chronology, but if it's somewhere around about 1500 BC or so, it might be about 900 years before the time of Daniel. So Daniel, we're looking at about 605 BC was when some suggest that he was taken with the first lot of exiles that were taken from Judah and taken on this journey that you can see here all the way to Babylon. Now, you might wonder why you go that direction and not just in a straight line. And it wasn't that they got lost, but actually, if you look at the geography, number one, you wouldn't go straight across. You'd be going through desert and mountains and so on. And these were really the trade routes. So you stayed on the best walking path that you could take. And this was the direction that you took and ended up at Babylon. Take a note, though, of some of the empires that are listed on that, because they're going to come up when we study Daniel. You've got the Babylonian Empire in the green that now includes Judea and is sort of bordering down into Egypt. But above it, you have the Median Empire, and we're going to hear about that in chapter 6 of Daniel with Darius the king. And then to the right, you can just see in the corner where it says Elam, it's sort of to the right of that, you have the Persian Empire. So in modern day terms, we've got Iran and Iraq are sort of the main geographical areas that we're looking at. And if you were to go on a little bit in time, you would end up with the Greek Empire coming from the west and coming around and taking much of this area here. So this is the geography. But one thing to note where Judah is, and really the land of Israel, is to see how strategic it was in terms of where it lay. Basically, it was kind of in between all the great world powers. You had Egypt to the south, then you had the northern kingdoms and powerhouses. And basically, if you wanted to control that region, you had to, in the end, try to take Israel. It sat between those two powers. If you looked at all of the trade routes, they all went through Israel. If you wanted to take goods from Egypt up to the north, you went through Israel, and likewise from the south, from the north down to the south. So basically, Israel was strategically placed right in the middle of the known world. I don't think that was a coincidence, of course. This was the land that God gave to the nation of Israel. It wasn't just doing it so that they might have good access to trade routes, but he was doing it, as Isaiah would later say, that God had given the nation of Israel as a light to the Gentiles, so that the Gentile nations might hear of the salvation of God, that they might find out what God was like. It was an ideal place then to place the nation of Israel as a witness to the nations around. Basically, they couldn't help but see. Imagine if they were coming from the north and some traders were coming down through Israel and they stopped at Jerusalem. Jerusalem was actually almost on one of the main trade routes that was up on top of the hills. And suppose they had just stopped and looked and asked somebody, what do you do in your temple? Where's your God? I said, well, we don't have a statue like you. Really? And you can imagine the conversation. Well, why don't you have a statue of your? Well, our God isn't like your God. Our God is the living God. God can't be made out of wood or stone or anything like that. So ideally placed, that was God's intention for the nation. You remember, though, the nation was really given four things, four promises. And if you go back to the book of Deuteronomy, you find them all spelt out, just as Moses was preparing the people to go over the Jordan and take the land. He reminded them of four things that God had given them. The first was the covenant. Within that covenant, God was making a promise. Well, it was really a reiteration in Deuteronomy of what was given in Exodus. But there was four great pillars that they had. One was the covenant. That ensured them, that gave them the sense that they had a relationship with God. God was going to be their God, and they were going to be God's people. God would pledge himself to them. They would have this relationship. It was symbolized as like a husband and a wife. God would take it upon himself to take care of them. The second thing was the promise of the land, and that was spelt out as an inheritance to the people. The third was within that land, there would be a place where he would put his name. And in that place, Jerusalem eventually, as it would become known really in the time of David, but God had said there'll be a place that I'll put where I'll want you to bring your sacrifices up to. And that will be the place where my name will be known. So you have a covenant, which is the pledge of relationship. You have a land, which was their inheritance. And even within that land, you could think and you could imagine that God was also promising to drive out their enemies. He would protect them within that land. So it was a place of security as well, not just a place where they could grow food. A temple, a place where God would put his name. And then actually, even in Deuteronomy, it was intimated that when they had a king, what kind of things that king should do. So there was even within Deuteronomy a bit of a foretelling that one day they would have a king. So, but these were the four things that the nation relied on. In a sense, though, they almost took these as what we might call eternal promises. They imagined that this covenant was forever. They imagined that the promise of the land was forever. They imagined that the promise that God would place his name in this city, Jerusalem, was forever. They could never imagine the temple being destroyed. They could never imagine God leaving Jerusalem. And fourthly, they could never imagine a king not sitting on the throne of David. Well, where did their thinking go wrong? Their thinking went wrong because they forgot that in Deuteronomy as well, there's all these curses. That if you don't obey, God said, then I'll bring curses upon you, and so on. And so basically, they just went through life assuming that those promises, what we might call almost eternal security, it didn't matter what they did, they thought. They could live however they liked, that these promises were something that God would never go back on. But what we're going to find in the time of Daniel is that every one of those four things, in a sense, has been removed. God is no longer calling them his people. In fact, you'll know from some of the other prophets that God said, the people who were once my people, he says, are no longer my people. The promise of the land was gone. They're going to be taken in exile. You can see that they'd already started to lose the land 100 years or so earlier under the Assyrian Empire. Was taking Israel to the north, and now even Judah itself. But you can imagine they're almost hanging on to these things as though this is where their hope was. Their hope was in the covenant. Their hope was in the land. Their hope was in the temple, the city of Jerusalem. Their hope was in the king. God will allow all of those things to be removed for one reason. As he says to them in Jeremiah chapter 2, he says, this is really the diagnosis of the problem. He said, my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed out cisterns for themselves, broken cisterns that can hold no water. Basically, what God was saying is that you've forgotten me. It's a really important lesson, isn't it? That we all lead. Sometimes we don't, there's a danger that we turn Christianity into a whole lot of props that we rely on, certain promises, certain verses, certain doctrines, certain truths, certain ways of gathering, and so on. And all of that can be almost a prop that gets in the way of what Christianity is. It's a relationship with him, relationship with the Lord. And what the Lord is saying is this: for all that you were hanging on to all of these other things, you've forgotten me. And he's going to take them into captivity. I'm going the wrong way. I want to speak just for a little bit about what we might think of as Daniel's worldview. Or I've called it what he saw from his window, because that is kind of a worldview or a view of the world. And we know that Daniel, at least 3 times a day, looked out his window. So I'm going to call this what he saw from his window. The first thing that he might have seen from his window was Babylon itself in all of its glory. You can read all of what the archaeologists tell us about the splendor of Babylon, but it was an incredible place. Incredible in that time of the world, their buildings, their architecture, their culture, their learnings, their education, and so on. It was incredible. Daniel had come from Jerusalem, which had nothing of this, nothing really that could be compared with Babylon. It would have been very easy for Daniel to have looked out and with a sense of envy in his heart wished that his life mirrored something of Babylon's. But it might have been easy as well for him, as he looked out his window towards Jerusalem, for his heart to have been filled with a sense of bitterness. It can happen. If he'd remembered back, he was taken captive, he maybe had been taken and his family had been left behind. He would have known as the years passed on and heard what had been happening in Jerusalem. The city had been taken, the temple had been destroyed, maybe some of his family had been killed, and he might have wondered whether he'd ever returned. It would be easy to look out your window if you were Daniel and be filled with a sense of bitterness that this wasn't what he imagined life to be. But he's also going to, as he's going to go through the book, he's going to tell us about a future hope for the nation, including the rebuilding of the temple. But that in itself has some nearly traps in it as well. And that is that it's very easy, if you were to be given a vision of something like this and be told that in the future someday God will put it all back again, it'd be easy to be filled with a sense of despair as well. How would that happen? I mean, they were just exiles. They'd left with nothing. I don't know if you ever thought about this in terms of just historically speaking. You take a few tens of thousands of people and they leave with nothing. How do they manage to rebuild a city in 70 years? Now, that's on record in history. We know that. That isn't even just from extra biblical material. Where do these people get all of the resources? Where do they get the enthusiasm to do it? Where do they ever get the hope that maybe there's some point to all of this? That is miraculous. Not even just from a spiritual sense, but even from a physical sense, that all of these exiles really could manage to get all of the resources that they would need to rebuild a temple. So it's possible then to look out your window and to have a worldview that could either lead to envy of what the world has, could lead to a sense of bitterness, perhaps about the journey of life and all of life's difficulties. It could be even filled with a sense of despair, even if you think of the hope of what God says is possible in the future, just to think that we don't have the resources to do it. So I want to think then just for a minute about what Daniel's worldview looked like, because this is really what we're going to see as we come through the book of Daniel. This to me is one of the great lessons of Daniel. It's that he thought about life right. When he looked out his window, he had the right perspective on Babylon. He had the right perspective on Israel. He had the right perspective on what God was doing. And with all of that, with that right worldview, he could then live and flourish and do what God intended him to do in Babylon. I've put this together. I don't know if this makes any sense to you, but this is what I mean by a worldview. It's really, those arrows, if you like, are almost like what I would call relationship arrows. A worldview helps me to understand what is the relationship between God and Israel. This is particularly Daniel's worldview, as he thought about what is God's relationship to Israel? What is God's relationship to the nations around? And what's the relationship between Israel and those nations? That really almost defines a worldview. So in the past, as I said, Daniel, if he looked back in his past, he would say, I understand what that worldview looked like. God made a covenant with the nation of Israel. He promised a whole lot of things. This is our worldview of our relationship with God. Israel was a special people. God had set them up that way. That's Jericho, by the way, in case you weren't sure. If he thought for a moment, okay, so what about the relationship between God and the nations? But if you'd gone back to what God promised to Moses and then Joshua and so on, was this, that God would fight their battles for them. And they saw that. God would drive out the nations from the land. But what about the relationship between the Gentile nations and Israel? Well, here's what God said to Moses in the book of Deuteronomy. The Lord will make you the head. He's speaking of the nation of Israel. The Lord will make you the head and not the tail. And you shall only go up and not down. That's how, I suppose, if you'd asked a Jew in the time of David or Solomon at the height of the glory, they would have said, this is exactly our worldview. This is how the world looks to us. This is how the world operates. But ask Daniel now, when he's sitting in Babylon, what the worldview looks like. Well, Ezekiel will say this, that the glory of the Lord departed the temple. That whole concept of God being their God and them being God's people was almost entirely lost and epitomized by the fact that God's glory left the temple in Jerusalem, and then he allowed it to be entirely destroyed and ransacked by the Babylonians. Well, what about the Gentile nations? Well, one day he looked out his window and he saw Nebuchadnezzar build a massive image of gold. The thing that Daniel would find out, and he would actually tell Nebuchadnezzar, is this, is actually God who gave the Gentile nations the power to become like this. Not so much to make statues, but the power and the authority for these world empires actually came from God. So now it must have seemed like to a Jew, God wasn't lifting them up now as the head, but he was actually giving the power and the glory to the Gentile nations. You see, everything is turned around. Well, what about the other way around? What about the relationship between the Gentiles and Israel? Well, instead of them being the head and the nations being the tail, the whole thing was flipped. Now, that's why I say, trying to get a worldview, try to put yourself in Daniel's shoes for a moment as he's in his room, looking out his window and thinking back on the past and looking at the present. 900 years, that first worldview had been established from Moses to Daniel's time. 900 years is a long time to get something into your mind and imagine that this is the way things will always work. But this worldview was entirely different, and it could shake anybody and anyone's faith. But a worldview isn't just something that you look at like a spectator in a stadium. So I'm putting here Daniel in the middle of his own worldview, because Daniel has to think about what his relationship is with God. Has God abandoned Daniel? Does God mean anything to Daniel now? Given that God has abandoned the nation on whole and has allowed the city to be destroyed. What about Daniel as an individual? What is his relationship with God? What about Daniel's relationship to the nation of Israel? Does he remain loyal to them now in Babylon, or does he abandon that and just try to mix in with the crowd and just try to get along with everybody else? Does he retain his distinctiveness as a Jew? Is that part of his worldview? Another question is, what about his relationship with the Gentile nations and Nebuchadnezzar? Is he to be a rebel? Is he to be a freedom fighter? I mean, is he to be a David against a Goliath? Is he meant to take a stone and try to knock the head of Nebuchadnezzar off? What is his relationship to the Gentile nations? And that really brings us then to chapter 1 that we read. In a sense, in chapter 1, we're actually going to get in a fairly light touch, a sense of what all of these relationships are to Daniel in particular. What about Daniel's relationship to God? Does he remain loyal to God? What about Daniel's relationship to Israel? Does he have any solidarity to the Jews, or does he just abandon that? And what about his relationship to Nebuchadnezzar and the world that he was now living in Babylon? Well, there are three things that I just want to point out from the chapter because I know you'll be fairly familiar with it. I want you to notice, well, actually four things. I want you to notice, first of all, just the first couple of verses. There's something important here to note. And that is almost right at the very outset to remember who is still at the top of this pyramid, if you like, or triangle. It says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Now, if you just stop there for a moment and think about that, this would have seemed almost impossible to imagine for a Jew, that God would allow a Gentile king just to walk in and take the holy city of Jerusalem. But notice what verse 2 says. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, and some of the vessels of the house of God. So right here at the very outset, we're almost getting Daniel's perspective, Daniel's worldview on what's happened. He sees that God has allowed it. But not only has God allowed it just to allow Jerusalem and the nation to be punished, but God is actually safeguarding two things here. He's safeguarding the king. He's put the king into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. And he's put his holy vessels into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. Now, that wasn't to be put into his hand to be destroyed. For as we're going to find out with the vessels in particular, when you get to end of chapter 5, Belshazzar, when he wants to put on a great feast, he calls for the vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had almost safeguarded in his house. He'd kept them, he'd showed them some reverence and respect and put these vessels that belonged to the God of Israel into his house. So God had actually done something here. Daniel had picked up on it, I would take it. God was still in control. God had actually safeguarded. It was as though he had put certain things in a safe. You know, if you're going away, you're leaving your place, you might get all of the most valuable things out of your house and put them in a safe in case people come in and destroy your house while you're away. God had certain things that really meant something, that were important for the future. One was a king. Not that this king, Jehoiakim, would end up back on the throne, but his lineage mattered. God had something in mind coming down through the centuries, didn't he? He needed to maintain the royal line. He needed to safeguard it. He puts Jehoiakim into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. And as we find out in other scriptures, he was well looked after. And he puts these holy vessels back into a safe place in Babylon, because one day he's going to have a temple that was rebuilt. And you remember in the days of Ezra and then Nehemiah afterwards, but Ezra in particular, they brought all of these vessels. They were still there. They were safeguarded. God was still in control, and he allows them then to be kept for a day in the future. Then there's three things that I want you to notice that happened to these young men in Babylon. Three things that they changed, that the Babylonians tried to change. They tried to change their education. They put them in the university. I don't think they really had much of a choice. They were taken from Jerusalem, and in those days, certainly the first lot were often, when Nebuchadnezzar arrived, he took the very brightest and the best of them, and some of the ones from the royal lineage, and he took them to Babylon first. And he got them, his plan was to get them re-educated into the world of Babylon so that they could be part of his administration. He changed their education. Secondly, he changed their names. You remember that they had good Hebrew names. And then he gives them here in chapter 1 new names. And then he changes their diet, or at least he tries to. He tries to feed them with the food from his own table. Changing their education. I want you just to note one or two things just about this, first of all. The one was this. We're going to have to think about what Daniel objected to and what he didn't object to. His worldview, as I said, has changed. He now has to rethink what is his relationship now to the Gentile nations. You know, he's not David fighting Goliath. He can't live as though he's a freedom fighter trying to turn back the world order, to make Israel the head of the nation. He realizes he has to live in Babylon. So he goes along with his friends to the education system, and he's prepared to take their lessons. In fact, we find he's so good, he's 10 times better than all of the other students that are there, and they get appointed some of the top places ultimately in Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. So he actually puts all of his efforts into his studies. He learns. It was a 3-year course, 3-year degree. You might think, well, that's a bit fanciful, all of this, but actually they have found in some of the archaeological digs in Babylon enormous libraries of clay tablets that were the learnings of these astrologers and magicians and all of these people that we think, well, they probably just made it up. They didn't make it up. Actually, there was very strict learning about how they were to interpret dreams. You might think that is just, sounds like, a bit of fiction, but it wasn't. In their mind, in these days, in the Gentile world, they figured that the gods sometimes communicated to the king via dreams. And for the good of the people and the nation, they had to know what the gods were intending to do. Now, sometimes they used astrology, and they tried to think about the stars. So some of these astrologers and so on, they had to understand to do with where the stars were going and mathematics and all of that. There was detailed studies. Some of them were more historians. They had to know, well, in the past, when a king had this kind of a dream, then this happened after that. It was almost like what we would call case law. If this happens, well, there's a past historical event that we could go back to and go through all of the archives and find out, well, in that particular event, when this king had that dream, then this happened, so that if 10 years' time a king has that kind of a dream, then they'd be called up. Well, what happened in the past? How would you interpret this? More like what we might call omens. So there was 3 years of intense studies. They had to know all of this. And when Nebuchadnezzar quizzed them, I don't know if this is like the final exam at the end of a 3-year degree, but they all had to stand before Nebuchadnezzar, and he says, these boys are the best. They've studied the hardest, although even here, as Daniel puts it, where did they get that from? Verse 17, and for these 4 years, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. And so, they put the effort in, I'm sure. I say this there's maybe 1 or 2 here that, it sounds like I'm, being a bit of a dad. Excuse it. It's just obviously in the text, so I can't be accused of. But yeah, I'm sure they put all their efforts in, but God gave them some special understanding. Why? God intended them to be in a particular place for a particular reason. I don't know if you've ever stopped to think about this. It dawned on me last night. as I was driving. In fact, I was driving up the whole length of England yesterday. It's another story for another time. But I was thinking, remember, God intended the nation of Israel to be a light to the Gentiles. That's how they were to get to know what God was like. He had a whole nation put there. Well, now they're gone. So you say, so God can't be known then in the world. He's no longer got a witness. We did. You won't believe this. But everybody in the known world got to hear about God. How does he do that? With these 4 men in this university, God he raises them up, he puts them right beside a king and 2 kings. In fact, Nebuchadnezzar writes twice to all of the people in his empire, and then Darius writes once, and he tells them all, I want to tell you something about God. Do you not find that an amazing thing? That even when the whole nation had lost its purpose, God finds 4 men that he raises up in a university in Babylon who are going to influence the 2 world leaders who are then going to write to every single subject in their empire and tell them about God. That's what God can do. That's a God who's in control. And that's their education. God had a purpose for it. Their names, I need to go quickly. Their names, you'll know they get changed. The 4 men, they all have names that either mean something to do with God. They have El after it. Daniel would be their name from Elohim. Or they have AH, like coming from Yahweh, the Lord. So basically, their parents had given them names that meant something about God. Take Daniel's, for instance. It means God is my judge. But then when they got to Babylon, their names were changed. Nebuchadnezzar gave them all names to do with his gods. So Belteshazzar, for example, given the name given to Daniel, is talking about Baal or Baal. And he will provide or he will keep. That's the idea of Belteshazzar. Their names were changed. Again, they don't object to that. They can't object in a way. The world will call you whatever it wants to call you. These men didn't go on strike or, I don't want a new name. They had to go along with it. That's the world they're living in. They had to go along with the education system. One thing, though, I did forget to say about the education system was this, that when Daniel came to have to interpret dreams, he didn't say, bring me all those clay tablets again, all the things I learned at university. So he was in the education system, but he recognized its limitations, and he recognized that God would be the ultimate source of knowledge that he needed in those times. But here with their names, they're changed. You can see the way that Nebuchadnezzar is trying to assimilate them into Babylonian culture. But then I just want you to notice finally in chapter 1 about their diet. And you remember that Nebuchadnezzar wants to give them the food from the king's table. Daniel objects. So this is the one thing that Daniel objects to. He doesn't go on a hunger strike, mind you, has been known, I think, particularly in these parts, for people to go on hunger strikes. But he doesn't go on a hunger strike. He has some sense and he has a bit of wisdom, and he goes to speak to the man who was the chief eunuch. And he tries to come up with a deal. He says to him, look, I tell you what, if I could show you that if we had this other diet, now it's called here in the ESV vegetables, might not be quite vegetables, actually. I'm going to tell you in a moment what I think it might be. I think they've used the word vegetables here because when they talk about the king's food, they think of that as meat. So then they go meat and vegetables. It might not just be that. And that is a comfort to those of us who wouldn't be too keen on a vegetarian diet. So this wasn't just like meat versus vegetarian. So if you see it on the internet, the Daniel diet or something like that as a new fad, don't worry about it. There's no need to go on that kind of a diet. Number one, for today's society, I don't think it would really work very well because he came back and they said, these men are really fat. So I don't think it would have the effect that they're looking for. But why would Daniel not eat the food? He was happy to go to the university. He was happy, really. He couldn't do anything about his name being changed. Why did he object to the food? It says that he wouldn't be defiled. Now, this is coming back to what I said about his relationship with God. Okay, he's in Babylon. Certain things he has to do because of his relationship with the Gentile nations now. But what about his relationship to God? He says there's a red line here I won't cross. I can't be defiled. And so he comes up with this other idea. Now, there's been three things that have been suggested about why this king's food might defile him and why he wouldn't want to eat it. One was the food laws. Some have suggested, well, maybe there was pork or various other things that would have been outlawed by the laws of Moses, and that's why he wouldn't eat, because it would have defiled him on those terms. Some people would say, well, perhaps it was food that had been offered to idols and that this was now being given to Daniel, and he would object on that grounds, a little bit like in 1 Corinthians, where Paul says to the Corinthians not to eat those sorts of foods if they knew that they'd been offered to idols. There is a third view, which I'd probably go along with, and I'll explain why I don't think the first two maybe are that good. The first one, the food, in terms of being breaking the food laws, I'm not really sure that that's the connotation here, because it's also his wine, and that wasn't outlawed in the food laws. So he has to change both, right? He goes to seeds or herbs and things like that, and water. It isn't just the food that he's not happy with. Secondly, I'm not sure that the idea that it's being offered to idols would also perhaps be the best reason. For this reason, these were their daily rations. So it would seem it's not like it's been offered after a festival or after some feast where they've offered it to idols, but this is the daily food, the daily rations that they were being offered. So there's another view which I would probably take, although I heed the warning here of James when I was talking to him about this week. He said I would just go with all three. He's a civil servant in the making, isn't he? If ever there was a diplomat. And the third one is this. It's not so much the food that might defile him, but it's whose hand it came from. It came from the king's table. Now, this has to do with his relationship with the nation of Israel. Why does he want a different sort of diet? I don't have time. You can look it up in Ezekiel chapter 4. Ezekiel's lying on the ground, acting out one of his many plays that he had to do. Well, they weren't really plays, but some of the terrible things he had to do. And one of them was to do with his diet. And he was enacting something that God was saying would be the diet of the exiles. There was no meat. It was barley and seeds and water. So I have a feeling, and this is the third view, that what Daniel is saying is this: I don't want to eat the luxuries that come from the king's table. I just want to eat the food of the exiles, my fellow Jews who were living around where he was. He was in the palace. He could have lived off all of the dainties of the king's table. But I wonder here if he's pledging some kind of allegiance here to his own people and saying, while they're in exile, while they're under this strict diet, while they're just getting the crumbs from Nebuchadnezzar's table, I don't want to be seen as someone who's living the high life up in the king's palace. I offer you that as a third reason. Now, in the last 5 minutes, the parallel structure of the book of Daniel. Hopefully everybody's seen what Josh sent out. Josh had sent it to me, and I said, look, really, this would be great for everybody. And it would save me trying to explain the structure of the book, because you've all seen it and read the big article, academic article. I can see JP sitting there ready to give me a whole rundown of it, which I'll ask him for after. I want to pick out not so much the structure. I'll say one or two things in a moment on this, but what I want you to pick out is actually the reason why Professor Gooding, I think, wrote that article that hopefully some of you have read. He wrote an article to show that there was this structure in the book of Daniel for a really important reason. In the academic world, Daniel, as some of you may know, is attacked because of the prophecies in the last few chapters are so like what happened in reality with the Persian Empire and the Greek Empire and their kings, Alexander and then Antiochus, Epiphanes, and so on. They are so like what actually happened in reality that they say they could not have been written at the same time as the earlier part of Daniel. And it had to have been written after the event. In other words, really the historical part finishes around about 165 AD when Epiphanes, Antiochus Epiphanes IV is killed. So they say it had to have come after that. So actually what Professor Gooding was writing here, and when you read it, this is really what his thrust is to show this. It couldn't have been composed by multiple authors who were just trying to stitch something together to try to make sense of history and write it as an afterfact. He said there's a clear pattern to this and a clear structure. That's the reason why he wrote it. Now, he didn't have accessible what we actually have right now as of last year. So when he wrote the article in 1981, the best dating of the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found that have the earliest manuscript evidence for Daniel 8 to 11, which have all of the prophecies to do with those nations falling, they placed it at about 120 BC, or about, now this is what a tablet they found, okay? This isn't the original copy, but a copy of a copy. They placed that at 120 BC, so 40 odd years after the actual events came to an end that are recorded in Daniel 11. Dr. Gooding makes a point at that point that even that is very close to the historical event. So here are some Jews living in the caves of Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, only 30 or 40 years after the actual physical events have happened. And they have these tablets. Someone says, well, they must have just made it up within that 30 years and somehow these fellows have got copies of it. Well, last year there was a paper, journal paper written in a scientific paper in a journal that went back and did some more thorough carbon dating and more thorough analysis of handwriting. That's how they try to work out the era. They placed it now between 230 and 160 BC. That means literally, even at the very latest date, it's literally a couple of years after Antiochus is being put to death. That would mean that those fellows who were in those caves must have almost had the original manuscript. They must have made it up. But of course, they weren't like that. They had all the other scriptures. Almost all of the scriptures have been found in those caves, and they treated them as the canon. They weren't making things up here. They actually kept them, Deuteronomy and so on. All the books except for Esther have been found in those caves. So the point I want to make and leave with you is this, that this structure not only shows that there was a single person who put it together, but that from even the dating of the texts and the manuscripts we have, that would place it before the events that actually take place. Now that's incredibly important, because when we come to the latter part of Daniel, we're going to be reading about events that are so closely mirrored to what happened in history that it will give us great confidence in the prophetic power of the scriptures. I'll finish this with this last slide. What's the book about? Most people would use the word the sovereignty of God when they come to Daniel, that God is in control, that God is in charge. Nebuchadnezzar has to admit it. Darius admits it. Daniel sees it. The nation will one day admit it. There's a son of man who comes and judges under the instruction of the Ancient of Days. God is ultimately in control. God is sovereign, they say. I'm going to suggest a slightly different word, and I'm going to say God's justice. For this reason, it would be easy to say that God has ultimate power in the world. But Nebuchadnezzar had a lot of power, and look what he did with it. Darius had a lot of power, look what he did with it. One day there's a man coming, and the man of sin, he'll have a lot of power, but look what he does with it. The amazing thing about Daniel is what we're going to find is what God does with his power. And that ultimately God is shown to be just in what he does. Now that is the key thing. You'll find it when Nebuchadnezzar is brought to eventually to his senses at the end of chapter 4. Do you remember basically when he writes out to everybody about God, one of the things he says is this: God does what is right. It isn't just that God is all powerful or that God is sovereign, but in his administration of justice, God does what's right. Now you get the same thing in chapter 9, which if you go back and look at the chart, chapter 4 and chapter 9 parallel, because they're both peoples that are brought back to God, restored. Chapter 4, it's Nebuchadnezzar. In chapter 9, it's the nation of Israel. And Daniel's seen as their representative, and he's praying. And when he thinks about everything that the nation's done wrong, he says, we were right to be judged and put into captivity. Then when he starts to think about what God is going to do for the nation, he says, God does what is right. It's an incredible thing when we're going to read through Daniel, is to find out how God actually administers this world, how God does what is right, how God takes up world leaders and then puts them down. He doesn't act haphazardly. He does what is right. So perhaps then the challenge is this: what do you see? What do I see when we look out our window? Because what we see when we look at our window, our worldview, will determine how we live in this world. But it'll determine something else. Because what Daniel did after he looked out his window was he got down on his knees and he prayed. And in chapter 6, it says two things that he did when he prayed. God gave God thanks. As he surveyed his worldview, he could understand what God was doing in the world. And despite all of the horrors that were going on in Jerusalem, he could give thanks. But the second thing, when the men arrived to take him, he was praying out loud. And it says this: he was asking God for help. Asking God for help. That's what a true worldview gives you. A sense that in your world, when you look out from your window, God can help you. And it took Daniel to his knees. And we trust that as we study Daniel, it'll do the same for us. Shall we pray? Father, we just give thanks now for this time that we've had together. And we do pray that you'll bless us. Do remember our brother Stevie and Jude as well, and the family at this time. And we just commit them to you especially. We thank you then for your word and for a hope that we have in it, in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.